Hello, welcome to the inaugural episode of Aurek to Zerek, a podcast in which I, your erstwhile host, will take you through the Star Wars expanded universe one letter at a time. We start today with Aurek, and in this instance, Aurek is for Aurebesh. Now, for those wondering, my name is Rooney. I've been co-host on a different podcast since last year, Talk Until the Joy Is Gone. Now, feel free to look it up, but it's definitely not safe for work, and I am not responsible for any offence caused by listening to it. Okay, seriously, you have been warned. Now, this is my first time going solo on a podcast. I am a long-time Star Wars nerd, a cosplayer, a podcaster, a bookworm, and just all-round geek. Aside from the films and TV shows, most of my Star Wars history is with what is now known as Legends. Basically, when Disney brought Lucasfilm back in October 2012 for $8 bajillion or something, they didn't want to have to deal with the expanded universe, so they wrote it all off as not canon and got to work stamping their own mouse-eared mark on the whole universe. Heads up, people, you won't find much love for the Disneyverse here. So if that's what you're after, then this is not the podcast for you. Move along. Now, the idea behind this podcast came into being after getting numerous messages from friends of mine after they'd watched episodes of The Mandalorian. They all came to me asking if certain characters, planets, ships, etc. were new things or if they'd been seen before in the Star Wars universe, or asking if I could give them background information or expand upon something they'd seen on screen. They all know that not only am I likely to know this sort of stuff, but I enjoy talking at length about it to anyone that asks, because seriously, just ask anyone who's made the mistake of asking me about Star Wars at like a house party or a pub or anywhere else. I can corner them for hours on end. Now, I realised that every reply I was sending was starting with, well, in the old EU, or in Legends, that sort of thing. And that got me to thinking, which is a dangerous thing, because it led me to the realisation that there was a lot of really cool and interesting lore out there, generated over 30 odd years of the old expanded universe, that a lot of people didn't know about. There were people out there who weren't even aware that such a thing existed, since Disney branded it all as Legends and effectively pushed it off into a dark corner to die. So I decided it was my calling in life to work through my favourites and the most interesting topics lurking within that huge body of work. So, what is the expanded universe? Well, briefly put, it's anything that was written or produced in the Star Wars universe that wasn't shown in a film or TV show, with a couple of notable exceptions, because some of them are also considered expanded universe. But we won't go into that just yet. So, that covers things like books and comics, video games and other spin-off materials. They were released around the films, and as the name suggests, they expanded the Star Wars universe. It was in the expanded universe that we found out what happens to Luke after the Battle of Endor, and he burns his dad, obviously, and how the rebels plan to rescue Han between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. It also gave us the history of the galaxy far, far away, dating back thousands of years, and then also, progressed the timeline hundreds of years into the future. It fleshed out characters we'd seen on screen, like Wedge Antilles, who, just putting that out there, is the greatest non-Jedi pilot in the galaxy, don't at me, and Mon Mothma, who obviously led the rebellion, whilst also creating whole new characters, like the perennial favourite Mara Jade, or Dash Rendar, Jaina Solo. Now, not all of the expanded universe was brilliant. Splinter of the Mind's Eye? Yeah, I'm looking at you. But, for the most part, considering how huge this body of work was, it was pretty good. At least in my not-so-humble opinion. Indeed, a lot of the earlier stuff released just after Episode 4, it was retconned and declared not canon because it wasn't up to snuff. It didn't fit with the rest of the universe that followed, meaning that even whilst the expanded universe was considered canon in general, it was constantly being updated and reshaped to fit this ever-changing universe as new things were created, new films were released. A big shout out at this point to Steve Sansweet, should he ever happen to listen to this, who was Director of Content Management up until 2011, which basically meant that his job was to try and make sure that this massive, sprawling universe made some kind of sense. So, a planet blown up in one novel didn't suddenly reappear fine and dandy in another novel set 10 years later. Some sort of continuity, which I can imagine, given the size and breadth of that expanded universe, was an absolute nightmare at times. Now, obviously, with the best will in the verse, I am not going to be able to cover everything in the expanded universe. To give you some idea of scale here, there are around 160 novels alone set in the expanded universe. I'm probably not even going to be able to cover most things. And unless every episode is about 8 hours long, I'm only ever going to be able to give a brief overview of the subjects. But my hope is that by doing that, and if necessary providing links to further resources, I can inspire others, that is, you guys listening to this, to go off and look this stuff up, or go and pick up some of the Legends branded novels or games or comics or whatever. So if I haven't scared you off or put you to sleep yet, I'll move on to the first topic in the series, which is the Aurebesh itself. The denizens of our favourite distant galaxy speak many, many different languages. Even on screen, we get to see a lot of different languages, such as Shiriwook, which is spoken by the Wookiees in their howls and huffs and growls. Huttese, the second most popular language, which is spoken by the Hutts and most other people that fall under the heading of scum and villainy. So, bounty hunters, the smugglers, the pirates, all the criminals. And even droid speak, as spoken by R2-D2, BB-8, R5, and most other droids that aren't protocol droids. But the most common language, and that's spoken by most of our heroes, is called Galactic Basic. Now, for all intents and purposes, Galactic Basic, often referred to as just Basic, is spoken like English, including the various regional accents. Hence why some people have that American twang, most Imperials sound English, and the Nemoidians sound sort of generically Asian. The written version of Basic is often referred to as Aurebesh, which is also the name of its basic alphabet. It takes its name from the first and second letters of this alphabet, namely Aurek and Besh. The Aurebesh consists of 34 symbols, each of which has a corresponding name. Now, I won't list them all here for the sake of brevity, and because I would likely mangle the pronunciation of half of them right now, but each of them will be mentioned when we get to it in its episode. These symbols cover all 26 letters in our English alphabet, plus 8 symbols which cover digraph sounds such as TH and OO. These additional characters are interchangeable with just using the individual characters for the digraph sounds. So, for instance, using 2 OSC characters for OO rather than the Orient character to represent the same thing. For clarification on this point, I've included a link to an image of the Aurebesh in the description of this episode. Now, there are also translations for most types of punctuation as well, which makes a grammar Nazi like me very happy, because who wants an alien language unless they can use the Oxford comma? Not me. The origins of Aurebesh have been lost to the eons, but it's thought to have been derived from the language used by the Rakatan Infinite Empire, which was founded around 36,000 years BBY, though it was apparently also found to be in use by some of the worlds that they went on to conquer, and worlds such as Tython hidden away in the deep core, suggesting that it may have come from an even older race, long since forgotten by the galaxy at large. Now, just a quick note on dates, for those of you not familiar with how the calendar works in Star Wars. The Battle of Yavin, which we see in Episode 4 A New Hope, is the date around which the calendar is built. Time is divided into BBY, before Battle of Yavin, and ABY, after Battle of Yavin. So, for instance, Order 66 was issued to the clones in 19 BBY, being 19 years before the Battle of Yavin, and Coruscant fell to the Yuuzhan Vong in 27 ABY, being 27 years after the Battle of Yavin. So effectively, A New Hope is the central point of the whole Star Wars calendar, and everything sort of revolves around that. Now, there's a second language of note here, which is that of the High Galactic alphabet. This was in use by the colonists of Alsaken, one of the core worlds, around 17,000 BBY. The world of Alsaken was frequently at war with Coruscant over the right to be considered the galactic capital, and during what came to be known as the Alsaken conflicts, which was basically a series of wars fought between the two planets and their allies over who would get to be the most important world, their written form of High Galactic began to spread. It used borrowed characters from the Tianese language, which to you and I are more or less the Greek alphabet, and added characters that they created themselves. In essence, it is Galactic Basic written with English or Roman characters. It was generally associated with the nobility and snobbish behaviours, people writing in that because they could, or because they wanted to appear high class or more important. You know the type. Now, the Jedi Code, the Book of Sith, Bounty Hunter's Guide, and the other books in that series of real-world publications are written in High Galactic, apparently, which explains why they can be read by us Terrans straight off the shelf without needing to translate them. Now, generally, the characters of Basic were written in the same size. There were no upper or lower cases, but on occasion, a character could be mirrored horizontally to denote uppercase letters. The language was written left to right or up to down, in keeping with the way English characters are written. Numerals were either written in their High Galactic style, which was basically a stylized Arabic numeral, or symbols made up of varying dots and dashes to represent the numbers sort of 0 through to 9, depending on local custom or personal preference. Now, over in the real world, the Aurebesh writing which appears in the original trilogy was created just to look good on screen. It was never intended to actually make any sense if it was ever translated. In fact, if you try with a lot of that, there are characters used on screen which aren't in the current Aurebesh as is now used, and the ones that are there don't make any sense. It's all just gibberish. The symbols didn't get their English counterparts until the Star Wars Miniatures Battles Companion book, which is quite a mouthful, was published by West End Games in 1994. The author, a chap called Stephen Crane, arranged the symbols seen on screen to create a functioning alphabet and thus a functioning written language, which, to be honest, is a feat I don't think gets enough recognition, because, creating a whole new language from scratch, it's pretty impressive. I'd like to do that, but I am far too easily distracted. Now, there are websites dedicated to the language and learning to read and write it, places such as Aurebesh.org, and various translators online that function like Google Translate, but for converting English to Aurebesh and vice versa. I did put a little bit of time into learning to read it a few years back, so that with a little bit of time I can usually work out what a sentence written in Aurebesh is saying. Though I was never very good at it, and with lack of practice I am incredibly rusty, as I discovered, much to my disappointment in doing my research for this episode. Now, whilst the basic seen on screen in the original releases of the original trilogy is effectively nonsense, and there are several instances of standard English being used, most notably on the tractor beam power gauge in A New Hope, where the words power and tractor beam are clearly visible. In the 2004 DVD version and all subsequent releases based on that updated version, these words have now been digitally replaced with their Aurebesh translations. Now, I know a lot of people complain about tampering with the classics, but this is a change that I definitely approve of, because it really helps with the immersion and creating the feeling that this is a fully fledged functioning world that we're stepping into, which is something I'm a big fan of. In that other Totally Not Safe for Work podcast, which I co-host, we have repeatedly praised the creators who really put the effort and the time into world building and really invest that into their creations. And Star Wars has probably one of the most travelled in, explored, mapped out and just generally built worlds to adventure in, because as I mentioned earlier, it's been getting expanded for a very long time by a lot of different people. So now we go on to the X-Wing controversy. Now, given what we've just covered, and if anyone has looked at the image for the Aurebesh that I linked in the description for this episode, there may be some of you out there scratching your heads and wondering, why are X-Wings called X-Wings when there's no X-shaped letter in the Aurebesh? This, my friends, is a good, if somewhat nerdy, question. X-Wings, A-Wings, B-Wings, Y-Wings, and even E-Wings are all names for starfighters that only make sense if you have a letter in your alphabet which resembles the ship. Aurebesh doesn't have any characters which match up with those ship names, so where do they come from? Well, 10 nerd points to anyone that remembered me mentioning the High Galactic alphabet. Since the High Galactic alphabet is just our Roman characters, that's where the ships get their designations. A bit like referring to certain real-world aircraft as Delta Wing, Delta being a character in the Greek alphabet. It's also where droids get their designations from as well, as there are no R's or D's in the Aurebesh, yet we have R2-D2. In the real world, the High Galactic alphabet was created to allow for inconsistencies such as these, because there is nothing in this world or the next worse than a Star Wars fan who thinks they've spotted an inconsistency. So, there you have it. A brief introduction not only to this podcast, but also to the written language of a galaxy far, far away, for whatever use that may be to you. There are, of course, lots of other languages in Star Wars, but this is the main one and the most complete. Now, I'll admit, it's not the most exciting of subjects, but it is quite a short one, and it should give you an idea of what this pod is all about, who I am, and why this pod has such an odd name. So, if you're a glutton for punishment and or Star Wars trivia, then come back for episode 2, which will be on the far more interesting subject of Beskar. So until then, so long, and may the Force be with you.